Right, okay, so we have a nice A4 piece of watercolour paper ready to go, and we're going to need some, as I said, some round things today. So I've got some ink pots and that sort of thing. Anything that you've got round, doesn't really matter what size. As long as we're working on A4, we don't want them to be too massive. So I just need to grab a pencil, because we're going to do a pencil. The thing about using watercolour with pencil is that the pencil line almost forms like a little barrier to where the paint and the water moves. So if we want to get more control into the paint that we're doing, we can use pencil to create like a little, like a little well, you know, or sort of like a little barrier to help to control what we're going to do. So it's quite nice to play with some different layers in this kind of way. So a lot of what I talk about when I'm doing these sort of doodle drawings is the idea of creating sort of like frames and shapes within the main shape to work in, because that helps us to make a start and sort of see where we're going to go. So the first thing, we're going to cluster some drawn circles at the top of our picture. So the idea is we're going to then paint around that and let the paint travel down. Now I've got my paper on a easel, so it's vertical, and I find that this is quite useful because it allows gravity to be on our side for once. So I'm going to just do my camera up so you can see where I am. I just need to do a quick tilt because it's a bit wobbly. There we go. So I'm just starting off with some circles on the surface, and I'm going to do maybe 5, I think, altogether, and it's quite nice to get a range of sizes if possible. So I'm going to do one quite large one, and that's the inside of a masking tape roll, which is a really handy, ever-present circle when I weed a sort of circle of things. Then I've got some handy sort of plastic discs. I've got sort of 2, and they're just sort of slightly overlapping, and then I can put in a third one. Always be a little bit wary when you're doing designs that have circles in them, just because they can look a bit like a face. You know, you can get a bit of a nose, mouth and so forth kind of thing coming on. So generally speaking, I try and keep to odd numbers, because then it's sort of less like 2 eyes staring back at you. And I'll probably try and do more than 3, because then you don't have the, oh, I've done 2 eyes and a nose kind of scenario. So I've got a large one, so then I'm going to come in with again, different sized pot of handy paint material. And it can go in sort of round there. So I've got 4, and then I want to do one that's slightly away from the others, so it's not necessarily connecting. Let me just find what can I grab that I haven't used already. Oh, well, it doesn't really matter. Here's a different kind of ink again. Do make sure the lids are on properly when you do this, as I have had an incident where the lid was not on properly, and the painting took a very different turn to well, you know, we still made it work, but you know, it was interesting. Right, so there we go. If you use a very hard pencil, then you can create almost even more of a dam, because it puts almost like a slight groove into the surface of the paper. But if you've got a soft pencil, it doesn't really matter. It's not a huge problem. So I've got my pencil sort of lines in there, and then again, when we're using watercolour, always think about that the paler colours, you tend to work from paler colours to darker colours, because with watercolour you can't make things lighter once you've painted them. It's sort of like a one-hit deal. So we try and keep to the sort of paler colours first. So I'd like you to, I'm going to use a yellow colour, some yellow colours on here first, and then we're going to go down through some shades of green, I think, and the yellow should hopefully look quite sunny. So instead of painting inside the circles, to begin with, we're certainly going to paint we're going to paint the outside of the circles. So circles are going to remain as bubbles of paper. So to begin with, I'm just going to take some water on my brush. I've got my nice square brush that I use quite a lot, and just come round the circle shapes. Just put a little bit of water. This is the sort of, you know, invisible painting at this stage, where I'm just getting the paper wet. I'm not going to do necessarily all the way down. I'm just going to start with working round the circles. And I've got a fairly light textured watercolour paper. I do often quite like quite a chunky paper, but we're going to use quite a light paper tonight because I want to get some quite fine detail in. So I've just got some water onto that paper now, and well, I've just wet around the circles, and I'm going to come back in and I want to mix up a yellow. To begin with, keep it very watery, so we don't want too much pigment in. It might be a bit faint to see, but hopefully it will become obvious. But we're going to start off with this pale sort of yellow around the circles. So just to get almost if they're sort of got an aura. I hope that's just about coming across. But we just got that aura of yellow round those circle pieces. There we go. So I'm just getting some yellow in. And of course you can use any colours that you have a mood to use. You can just start with your palest one first. So you might stick to a much more restricted colour palette and just go for shades of one colour. But at the moment we just want to get that sort of yellow outline around the pieces. And it's quite light and sort of quite sunny in feel at the moment, isn't it? Clearly the sunny weather is going to our heads because we have finally got some sunny weather. But that helps to kind of, I know it's been fantastic. A long may it last. Right, so let's, and then I want to try and get a little bit more water onto that surface because I want to start making this paint do some dribbling. So I'm going to add just some water, and that's what I want to try and happen. I want to get that to sort of run down the page and get like a line moving down, because with these sort of abstracts it's really lovely to have these sort of lines in place because they'll give us something to work on and something to play with. So to get that to work, if it's not running, just come back with some water on the brush and add in some water and get that to sort of start to whiz down the page and to get that sort of energy. And it's always quite nice if you build some drips into your artwork and then you can dry it off and actually we might try this, we'll see, turn it upside down, because then suddenly your drips are, instead of going with gravity, they're doing the complete opposite. They're sort of fighting gravity, and it gives it quite different energy. So now I'm adding in a slightly stronger yellow into some of that circle. So just again close up to the pieces and just working around them, following that pencil line. But then if a drip happens, let's go with that drip. Let's push that on a bit further. And I'm just sort of focusing maybe in around the larger one, just with a bit more yellow. And then I don't want to have any hard edge brush marks, so if I see anything that looks a bit hard, I can just soften it out by putting in some water and letting it soften down and sort of just changing that a bit. Now we're going to then come in and add, you can see up here, look, where I've sort of paint, and that sort of paint just follows that pencil line. So it's quite good because the pencil line acts as that little sort of reservoir just to keep it in place. And then I want to add some new colours in sort of around that. With these ones, before I add the colour in, I want to wash up my brush, and I'm going to put just some water again on this lower half to now wet the surface down. And why I'm doing that is that when I get drips this time, they're going to have a different surface to operate across, so they're going to do something different, and because they are going to be in a slightly stronger colour, we're going to see more of what they do. So I'm going to use a blue. It's probably going to give it a very greenish tinge because we're going on top of the yellow, and we could get the hairdryers out or leave that to dry for just a few minutes, and so we're taking the sort of live quality out of the paint a bit. But I'm just going to crack on because I quite want to see how these things mix together. So I'm using quite a turquoisey blue. You can use whatever blue you feel, whatever mood of blue you feel. When I paint this time though, I'm going to not come as close as the circles. So I'm going to just try and leave a yellow edge, even if I get dribbles and things happening. I don't mind about that, but I just want to leave some of that yellow in place so that it's not interfered with the blue. If the blue runs down through it like that, that's fine. But I'm going to just leave so that we're getting some of that sort of meridian of yellow still in the piece. And then hopefully when these drips happen, they're going across a wet surface, and we should see something different or slightly different feel. And if we're not getting one, if it's refusing to, like this one is being very shy and modest and not wanting to explode. So again, I'm going to put some paint and then some water and almost just like pump the brush to see if that's going to roll down and do something different. This is quite a fine paper, so I'm not quite getting the fuzzy spread that I was hoping for, but you know, we're going to keep going. So because we're going to see what it does give us. So then I've got these lovely colours washing around together. I don't want to have this sort of hard brush mark edge here, so I'm going to come back with some water and just soften that out a bit by just sort of painting on top. I'm flicking my brush across. Let's see what happens. Adding a bit more water on top. I'm bringing the blue in top of that one a bit. Maybe coming around that one a bit more, but still trying to keep those white areas as sort of being quite untouched. And then let's get some more dark. As it comes down, I want to get some more blue happening sort of lower down, because with that you get, wherever you're adding the stronger colour, gives you a kind of weight in the image. So I like to get that coming down into the bottom, into the sort of lower edge, and then we're going to get more sort of sense of gravity into a piece. And that blue is looking really nice, and I want to start adding some water in. Oh look, let's encourage that down. That's getting some nice dribbles and stems, or whatever we're going to call them. And I get a few splats as well. Splats are always good. We do like a splat because we just got to think the whole time what we're doing is we're creating something that then we can play with later. So we're just wanting to get colours onto here that we like. We want to get some nice bits like we're getting here where this blue is sort of merging into the green, because it's all about giving ourselves surfaces to explore with the pen later. And this is when you can really choose the colours that you want to play with, the ones that you are really drawn to, because you know that's going to mean that you're going to want to keep looking at it and keep working at it. So let's all these are starting to come down, and I'm going to start. We're starting to get quite a nice fuzzing happening on this sort of side here, where this is sort of spreading out, and this is really because the paper is getting wetter there. So if I add some more water in, just to really soften that surface up and get it to spread and move and get interesting things to happen. And you can see how over on this side this has been on for a while, so it's starting to get quite a lot paler. This one is starting to lighten up as well, so we can go back over and come in again with some second layer of pigment, just with the blue again, but just to go on top of that, and then we get an extra layer. We want to keep that intensity. And this is where painting inks are fantastic, and I'm a big fan of painting with ink because the colours are really, really intense and they look really beautiful on top of these sort of more faint colours. So now we're getting, hopefully, let me just tilt my camera a tiny bit up, we're getting that sort of sense of gravity and sort of gradation between the sort of two here. We've got those circles in. I think I'm just going to add a little bit more blue, not least because where I've got my masking tape, that's going to stay white, and I'm probably going to crop the image at that point, so I want to get a little bit more blue into some of the edges, so it gives this kind of like a nice radiant feel, like that. And I think I'm going to get some colour into the circles looking at it. I'm feeling that they're sort of, I think what would be quite nice is where you get an overlap of those circles to maybe have a background just in that overlap. But I'm still thinking about that, because some, you know, until you sort of start getting the paint moving on the paper, you can't necessarily decide where you're going next. You know, that's the sort of fun of it, really, seeing what it's doing to you. But I'm thinking at the moment those circles are definitely maybe calling out to me for something to happen to them. Right, I want to come back in with a stronger blue again, so now like much more into the sort of deep navies. And I'm going to come and add some of the deep navy colour that I can get going into the bottom section as well, to add even more kind of weight. And it'll hopefully keep that sort of glowing feeling of the yellow around the sort of circles at the top. Again, if you want to make watercolours darker, if you want to get into darker tones, I would avoid trying to put black with them, because that does tend to make, it just really deadens them out, makes them very grey, and you sort of lose a lot of the vibrancy. So for the blue colours, you want to sort of look for the maybe adding a little bit of red into that blue, so it goes slightly towards the purple edge, and maybe a little bit of dark green, and that should give you a darker colour without getting into the very sort of black tones, that, or the sort of greyish tones. Right, so I've mixed that up, so I've got a little bit of green into that blue. I'm just bringing that along, just sort of dabbing, very sort of little sort of dabbing motions with the brush, just to sort of get that paint moving along. And so we get, again, another layer of tone and sort of darkness coming across. And then once I've got that paint on, I can come back with some water on the brush just to start getting some movement into it. And you can see how it creates sort of like rivulets and paths for itself, and it's sort of like, it likes to follow the paths of least resistance where the ones have been before. And you can sort of play with that. And then I'm just going to keep adding little bits of like pumping, almost like pumping water across the surface. This may be where you need to have a tea towel down or something to catch the drips, but just keeping on pushing that paint from the brush so that it's creating that movement, and it's sort of like creating these lovely tides of pigment through the piece. Right, so we're not going to do a lot more painting on that because we want to have a look at some of the pen work we can do, but I do think we want to put something into those white circles that are sitting there now looking sad and lonely, or looking like they need to have some sort of colour. So I'm going to choose a fine brush, well, I say fine brush, a finer brush, a kind of a medium sort of round brush like that, and I'm not going to put any water on, but I just want to get a little hint of colour into those circles. And there's me saying how, you know, we have to sort of start with the paler colours, but what we can do is, if we have like wells or islands of paper left in the design, we can go back in then with something paler and just sort of add to them. So where I've got this overlap, I'm just going to put a little bit of orange, but not sort of like tango orange, but you know, like just a sort of an earthy kind of dark yellow maybe. And I'm going to do an outline, so outline the kind of shape like that, and then I'm going to come back with a wet brush and just where that outline is, just soften with water and just try and smudge it into the centre. Let's see what that does. And that's sort of like changing, because now we're kind of seeing these shapes more like crescents, because we've sort of taken a bite out of them. They're sort of more like crescent moon shapes, and I quite like that. Not 100% sure, but you know, we just keep going. I think what I'm going to do is, while that's really wet, I'm going to get a slightly richer orange and just see if I can get a bit more, like just pump some of that into the shape and let that, you know, if that moves off and it runs through, I don't mind that at all. That's more interesting to me, I think. And then I think I'm going to go right in with a red into that orange that I've already put down. But again, just bringing a line of orange up through it, of orangey red, just into that. But now it's nice and wet and it starts to do something, and there's something a bit more interesting happening there. Right, so then I'm going to do the same sort of idea with the other overlaps. So I'm going to start with, let's put some more water on first and see what happens. So wet paint into that oval or kind of overlap point like that, plenty of wet, and then again go in with some stronger oranges while it's wet, and so I'm sort of like pushing the brush, like pushing a line of paint, pushing it through the middle, so it's got a sort of form and it starts to run. I've got a bit of a drop, and then go back in with some red and just pulse that in on top of it. And all of my red's going all the way to the top of that edge. Why not? Let's see what it's doing. It seems to want to do that, so let's do that. And then I've got a last one here. So again, back into the sort of orangey yellow, paler like that, and then all of this will give us spaces to think about and work around when we come to do some pen work. And here I'm just going to add in that orange colour seems to want to sort of come into that yellow zone and slightly link those two areas. So I'm now creating a kind of link between those two and that sort of echo of the orange round that. So it's sort of travelling round, and then I want to put my darker orange into the middle and sort of move that across. Right, okay, so do you want to do anything else? I'm going to soften that down. Don't want it to be too much like a jam sandwich, just want to soften that up a bit. Maybe bring some of my orange, now that I'm seeing, so I'm quite liking this, now adding in over that yellow. I'm going to put a bit more warmth just in round that, close to the circles, because that's now sort of gradiating out into that yellow, so we're getting that sort of nice variation of colour. And I can use a brush, and on a wet surface I've still got some control on it because it's damp rather than wringing wet. Just sort of bring some of those edges round. And I'm going to do a little hint of it. Look, I've just got room. You may have more room around yours, but I can just do a little hint of it round here. And I don't want it to be too stripy, so where I've got too hard an edge blending into the yellow, I'm then going to go back and before it dries, just flick a little bit of water over it just to sort of help that blend in. And there we go. Right, okay, so now we're going to do hit the hairdryer. So we're going to have a couple of minutes of hair drying. We want to take all the moisture out of the surface. Obviously, as I say boringly every week, if you were doing this and you had a bit more time, I would say leave it to sit and dry naturally and then give it a quick iron if it's bumpy and lumpy. Dry iron, probably put a piece of spare paper on top and underneath, and then dry iron over the top to take out any wrinkles. But as we're on a class, we're going to have a momentary break, grab the hair dryers and try and get that surface now nice and dry, because then we're going to work in on top with some pen and ink detail. Right, so I'm going to mute because nobody needs my hairdryer in super surround sound, and I'll be back once that's done. Right, okay, so I've got mine dried off now, so it's lovely and dry for touch. It doesn't take a minute really, it's quite handy, and if you're impatient then it's even better, you know, you can speed things up along. Right, so just you know, for interest's sake, you can see how once you've got this base, you don't have to stay in one particular dimension or another. You get to move around from different sort of surfaces. So when you turn it upside down, it has a very different sort of feel. It now becomes something like a sort of forest, you know, sort of growing upwards. So I think we might work on it this way round just to see. So I quite like this feeling. It's almost like the potential of things growing underground, and then this becomes the sort of the forest coming up through, or the sort of result of the growth. So let's turn them upside down. I'd probably give this an iron because it is slightly bobbly, being quite a fine paper, but I think I can work with it, a slightly wobbly surface. Right, so I'm going to just put some masking tape on. So I'm just going to be using black fine liners. If you've got some coloured ones, they can be really nice to use as well, but I'm not going to base the whole piece on coloured fine liners because not everyone may have them, so it's a bit unfair, you know, to do that. And as I've got to think about, we have got these pencil lines here, so we've got to sort of think about how we're going to work them into what we're doing, like that. But so I'm going to start with some sort of what this gives me the feeling of, as I said, because we've got this sort of sense now of this being something in the earth and then something growing up. I'd like this sort of feel of like almost radiating, or kind of like potential happening inside these shapes. So I'm going to focus in on this little area here first. So you're looking at sort of like an overlap area. I'm going to put some detailing into these sort of ellipses, or sort of Marquisite shapes, and then I'm going to bring some rays coming out, and then we'll see what happens when they meet each other. And they're going to hopefully have a feeling a little bit, I'm sort of seeing in my mind sort of like some of those incredible seed cases that you get, and sort of like amazing sort of fruiting bodies from the natural world. So I've got a 0.3 pen. I would go for a medium nib, so 0.3, 0.4, 0.5, something like that. Not too thin yet and not too big, so we've got room to go either way. And then on this sort of section here, because when we painted like a sort of margin through the middle. So I'm going to start just by looking where I can definitely see that richer colour. And I'm just doing some little circle designs, just sort of identifying where they come. And when I say circles, they don't have to be, in any way perfect circles. But, just small round shapes. Just clustering along that line. Down here. Just drawing those through. And, excuse me getting distracted there, but I'm getting requests for going to the shop to buy ice cream. Because it's a sunny day, This desperate face has appeared over the top of my, trying to distract me, going, "Can I borrow your card and get ice cream?" So I'm going to give up and say, yes, you can go and get ice cream. As long as you get your mummy an ice cream as well. Right, okay, so I've just got this like cluster then, and it has this sort of, and because we're using where the paint has gone, so we've drawn around this slightly darker centre, it kind of enhances that effect, because whenever we're adding little detail in, it's adding surface, but it's also adding shade and tone and darkness, because it's by adding more pen, we're sort of putting a bit of black onto the paper, and that's making everything a little bit darker. So that's sort of like, it's starting to enhance that kind of feeling. This is like a sort of centre. And then we've got this sort of outline sort of round here. So I'm just going to start off by drawing that in along this sort of ellipse shape. And coming round like that, just so it's sort of becoming more of a three-dimensional kind of shape. And I'm probably just going to add in some little tiny ones where I've got this sort of, again, this sort of slight outline that I painted. I'm just going to add a few, not so many, because I just want just to make that edge a bit stronger, so it kind of has a bit more definition. And just they sort of come around, so it sort of get a feeling almost like a rind, or a sort of, a cross section. I remember once finding in a jumble sale back in the day when we had, I never see jumble sales these days, but back in the day, you don't see them, and we used to have loads of them. There was like, where I grew up, there was one that happened 4 times a year, sort of big, and it was like a real event, because you'd get some amazing stuff there, because it was old enough that I'm old enough that people hadn't understood the value of second hand, I think, at that point. And we used to as teenagers, we used to buy like, real mink fur coats and things like this, which we probably shouldn't buy, but I know, but you could find them, and things like that. And I remember finding this fantastic book that was printed in about 1880, and it was a scientific manual with cross sections of plants, but sort of drawn in these beautiful scientific illustrations, and they all had this kind of feel. It was incredible sort of line work. They were from sort of early microscope experiments, and I used to think how amazing that must have been, because we get so blasé with these things, because we've seen them, haven't we? But for the first time that someone showed you what a sort of seed looked like, it drawn at this sort of size, and which in turn reminds me of, I'm going to do the same sort of similar sort of thing here in this section here. Reminds me of, there's a very interesting social study that was sort of document of people's jobs in about a similar sort of time period, and there was a guy who's documented whose job was, he had a travelling microscope, and people would pay a penny to look at everyday objects, and he had this whole sort of banter that he did, where he would sort of say, come and, they had like a flea that you looked at, and he said, look, if it was this size in real life, it would feed a family of 12 for, a whole Christmas lunch, And I thought, do you know what, if you went to a shopping centre today and you set up with an electron microscope and said, do you want to come and see these things, I bet people would queue around the block, actually. Because there is something so magical about seeing these tiny, incredible worlds. But there we go. So again, I've just done this, so it's sort of like a sort of echoing kind of shape here with this sort of outline. And then I'm going to do the same thing in this sort of ellipse here, just to create this almost like seed-like quality. And I think when you've got the pencil line like this, you have to sort of work with it. You can get some really lovely effects where you sketch things very lightly in pencil and then wash them over almost uncaringly with the paint, and then they sort of like come grinning through like sort of ghosts out of the mist, there's loads of experimentation to be done there. But right, so then we've got these sort of like ellipses shapes. Now I'd like to get some lines, some sort of rays coming in. So I'm building up to it gently because I'm not sure what's going to happen here when they meet each other. But so I'm going to do this side, one of these sort of circles first. So I'm going to just take some lines coming out to touch that circle that we drew in pencil. And what I quite like to do is when I hit that pencil line is just do a little, like a full stop almost. And the line's not just coming out and stopping. It's got a little moment where it actually stops. I think it's one of the really important things that I learned on one of my design degrees when I was studying metalwork. One of my tutors said, think about how something stops, because you're in control of that shape. And, you might want a blunt edge, you might want it to taper off to a point, but just make sure that you've made a decision about where something ends. And you're not just stopping because, you've run out of, in that case, copper or whatever, but, you've run out and so you make it that long, Try and always think about where your line ends and what happens when it ends. So once I've got some spread in, I can come back and do some in between. I find that easier. If you want to get them very close together, I find it much easier to do them relatively wide apart. Do like first row and then come back and do one in between. And then you sort of think, I don't know if I can fit any more between that. I don't know how I can get that to work. But if you then change to a finer gauge pen, if you've got a set that has like some, 0.1 or even this is a 0.5, you can then come back in between again, and suddenly those first lines start to look quite massive. It's funny when I've been drawing with 0.1 or sort of 0.5 pens quite a lot, and I pick up a 0.5, somehow it suddenly feels like a giant marker pen. And vice versa, if you've been doing some big mark making, the fine ones appear even finer. But if you go back in between, I think it just adds a really nice contrast between the lines and the sort of surfaces, and it doesn't make it too stripy, because whenever you're doing a pen work, your pen is pre-selected to give you a kind of strength of line. So the thinner the pen you choose, the sort of overall lighter impact it has on the paper. It's, very sort of simple. Thin ones are thinner, fat ones are fatter. But it sort of allows you to then play with that sense of tone and sort of depth. So if you want to make something look finer and more delicate, you just pick up a more delicate pen and then it's already sort of like done half the work for you. So I really quite like the way this is feeling now because of this sort of like contrast. It sort of makes it look quite dynamic, and this sort of black line on it is really interesting. So I'm going to do the same thing on these other halves, and then we've got to decide, we're obviously going to come off here as well, and then there's going to be a point where they meet in the middle, so we're going to have to work out what we do with that. But again, same idea with this one. I sort of usually start off, and if you start putting a slight curve into your lines, then that starts to also indicate that your circle that you're filling in might have a slight curve to it. It starts to sort of not just be a decorative line, but it also describes the surface. And to get it to look sort of curved, if you sort of, the ones that are going across the middle, if you keep them relatively straight, and then as you go down from those, as you go sort of left, I suppose, although this is sort of up and down really, if you go left and you give a slightly left curve to your lines, then you go, as you go right, you slightly curve the other way, you can get a convex or a concave feel. Although I've slightly muffed that up by putting the lines the wrong way around, but You also can decide not that you weren't going to do that anyway, because this is Doodle, and that is the wonderful thing about abstract Doodle. It can be whatever you want it to be, and you make up your own rules. So I'm going to come back down through those, but I really like the little dot at the end of the line. I think it just adds so much, even though it's just the tiniest and most fundamental mark that you make, a little dot. And yet I think it just really helps those lines, gives them purpose. And then once I've got those in, I can come back with my very fine pen and just draw in between. And if some of them touch, I don't mind that at all. I think it gives it, you get this lovely wave of shadow, because again, as the lines come close together, they appear darker on the page. So where you get them moving close together, from a distance it creates a kind of little shadow, and where you get them moving apart, it almost creates like a highlight. And after a while you can see, you kind of get a rhythm of light and shade moving across the piece, and it's almost like a sort of sound wave or something coming up between them. And I just think it has a really lovely feel. And it just gives it a very different sort of, it's a way of creating sort of a rhythm and a movement. And you can just do really simple exercises just to draw some circles like this, and then just draw these lines, and then just see if you can create a wave and sort of get it to work through the lines. And you do that by sort of just putting a tiny bump into one of the lines. In fact, let's do that on this piece because it's so much fun to do. You can see, I'll show you how you get this kind of echoing effect. So if we do our first line on this one, or your equivalent of this one, quite relatively straight, there's a little bit of a curve. But then as you come up from that, the next one, you're just going to put a slight bump like that. So it doesn't really matter what shape you do, but just give it a bump, and then you just copy that shape each time. And you'll find that you tend to, because we're not robots, make a slight little error each time. That error starts to kind of give you an exaggeration, and that exaggeration starts forming a little wavy pattern inside your shape. And you can get like a sort of pulse, and you can decide to, right, I'm going to bring my lines really close together and then open them out again. And then that pulse starts to kind of appear like a visual representation of sound or movement kind of across that. And then you can open that up again and bring a different pulse in, look, just by bringing that in. So I've got sort of like a different feel. And it's like sort of contour lines. But it just becomes endlessly fascinating just creating these little moments of shadow by letting those lines come together and then letting them open out again. And it just varies that shape and changes what you're doing. And it starts to describe a different sort of surface. So again, if I bring that up to the end like that, that sort of, you can see how it's like a sort of a quilt almost, like a sort of stripy quilt that's moving over a surface. And I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to do this side. I'm just going to slightly mute so I can have a drink of squash while I'm just doing this bit as well, because it's a hot night and my throat's getting a bit dry. I'm going to continue down this way, and I'm going to put another wobble in this side and see where the pattern takes me on that side. That's better. I'm only muting when I drink my squash, otherwise you get a terrible gulp translating onto the soundtrack, which is, nobody wants to share that. But you can see a different pattern is happening on this side, and I can just control it by bringing my lines together and letting them move apart. And just letting them sort of open and close, and just keep thinking when they come together, that makes a darker or more of an impact, because you've got more black lines close together, it's just more putting more darkness on the page. And then when they open out and spread out, you're letting more paper through, so you get a lighter kind of feel. And you can see how that starts creating these lovely lines. And you just get this lovely sort of ripply kind of wave, like sound effect feel coming through, which I really enjoy. And so that gives me an idea for this central one. I think what we're going to do is let them all join up and see if we can get like a sort of third pattern. I hate to say third wave because we don't want one of those, but like a sort of wave coming through from 3 points, because at the moment we've really got a wave that's generating from 2 points, because we've got the sort of side of the seed and then out to the edge of the circle. So I think it'd be nice to see what kind of shapes and forms happen when you've got 3 starting points. So I'm just coming back and adding in my little 0.5 lines in between the 0.3 lines. And you always have to think, the strength of these patterns, or strength of these patterns, is that although it's a doodle world and you can obviously totally break any rule you make at any point and change your mind, sometimes it's quite nice to say, right, I'm going to have I want to create this unity between these 3 separate pieces, and I want them to look like they're all part of the same composition. So I've set up this parameter for myself in that when I do these lines, the last thing I do is put this thinner line in between. It's not a very taxing rule, it's quite a sort of nice rule. So you think, right, so I'm going to do that. Whenever I do these lines on this piece, I'm going to use that commandment. So I will say, right, whenever I do these 0.3 millimeter lines, I will then go and put the extra fine 0.5 line through. And then it just helps to unify what you're doing. And also it's that thing of, part of the reason why we have the paint on, part of the reason why we set up these areas for ourselves to work in, is that in a way that's taking away some of the thinking process, because we're not thinking I must draw these circles. I'm thinking these circles already exist and I'm working with them. And it's so often the way that, to begin with, when you first start thinking about artistic projects, people say, just do whatever you like, do something, and that is the most daunting and terrifying thing anyone can say to you, because, it's too big. It's like, you can... Exactly. It's like when someone says to you, have you got any questions? No, you never have a question when someone says that, because all the questions you have disappear out of your mind. Like there was never a question there ever. And it's the same with this. And so I feel that, this is why I think, working within a brief, or not a brief as such, but within a set of rules and parameters, is just really useful, because you think, well, I know where to start. I don't know where I'm going to finish, but at least I can start. And then, so I'm going to bring these lines through to start off with. I'm just going to do almost like a triangle in the middle. And I know that I'm going to bring these lines, at least we know we're going to go that way, we're going to go that way, we're going to go that way, and then we'll work out what we do in the triangle. But we've got somewhere to start, haven't we? And it's always that thing of, everything is daunting until you've made a start. It's always the thinking about it is almost the most daunting bit, isn't it? And once you actually get going, then stuff starts to happen, and then you think, well, I don't know what I'm doing up here yet, but I know what I'm doing this bit, so we'll get this bit done, and then we'll see what we think. And it's this sort of a patchwork approach, I think, which is really sort of liberating, because then you're not worrying about, and if things don't work out, well, it's a doodle, so it's fine. But every time you do one of these, you learn a different way of making a mark, a different way that a line might go across the page. You think about the kind of impact that it has and the rhythm it creates, and then you're just adding to your bank of mark-making knowledge. And then as you go on, you can say, I'm drawing a picture of, if I was drawing, maybe a study of some beautiful mushrooms or fungi or something, and then I might go, oh, wait a minute, that lining, doing those lines, has got a real feel of that sort of underneath the mushroom. So can I use that technique to draw my mushroom gills, And it's just all about learning, just building up that confidence between hand and eye, without putting the pressure on of having to achieve a recognisable thing as well, because that's always what I think so many people struggle with, is that, you know, when they do an art piece, they want it to look like something. Yes, you see, you know what I'm talking about. But, you know, you have a terrible burden of, like, you know, people say, oh, well, you know, sort of judge artworks on whether something looks like something else, you know, and actually, you know, it should be almost much more about, you know, how it makes you feel. And, you know, I think so. And I think it's but this is why I love this sort of work, because I'm not trying to do anything. I'm just letting the lines and the paint surfaces suggest where to go next. So it's like a lovely dialogue between me and this piece of artwork, and I don't have to, you know, I don't have to have a destination in sight. I just lets me see where, you know, let it take me where it wants to. And then slowly, I think, through that process, you learn to control that journey a bit more when you want to. Some pieces you never want to, you just want to let it happen, and that's great. And then, you know, and then someone says, oh, can you do this sort of thing? And you go, oh, actually, look, I did that on that doodle, I did that sort of mark, and that worked really well, and that reminds me of this, perhaps I can use that. And then you're creating a language or a sort of conversation between you and the observer. As I always say to people, well, all mark making to a certain extent it's a bargain that we strike between ourselves and the viewer, because we're not actually making a tree, we're drawing a picture of a tree. So we're saying, right, when I do this shape, that means tree, all right? And your viewer goes, yep, I can see that means tree, I'll go for that. And so you're creating almost like a language of marks between you and your viewer, like a sort of semaphore or a code. You know, I go, oh, when I use this brush mark, we're going to say that that's a sunset. And you go, yep, that's a sunset, lovely. And if you think of all the different ways that people could portray a sunset, you know, they could use Photoshop and create very strong graphic gradiated colours. They could use charcoal and sort of like do it all in monochrome. They could do all sorts of things, and all of those things would be sunsets. But it's having the confidence and the understanding of your media to say, when I do a sunset, this is how I do it. And everyone says, yep, okay. Which is my bit of art philosophy for the this evening. Right, so I'm just going to do a few more of these 0.5, and then we're going to decide what's going to happen in this central area. And with this sort of, you know, is the triangle going to move in, getting smaller and smaller until there's a little triangle in the middle? Well, we'll see what happens when we get there. But I'm just putting some of these finer lines in. You don't, you know, again, as like I said, it's really nice to set up a rule and a parameter, and then it's also quite nice if you need to, you can always break it, because this is your painting. So, you know, so if you feel that you've got enough lines in one space, you can skip a few, I'll let you off. So we'll just take that one through there and bring those through. And I was in Rochester today. I just mentioned it because it made me think of, I've been doing a project with one of the councils of art walks, and you can now, if you go to Rochester or if you go to part of Chatham, you can download an app, and my voice will take you on a little walk around, giving you creative ideas so, about what's in front of you. I know it's run by Dizzy O'Dare. I'll have to see if I can find a link, but it's called Rochester Motorway Art Walks. Right, so with this triangle here, I'm going to just start going round, like back and forth to each one, but I'm going to go in and out of the same spot, as it were. And of course, as I go in and out of these same spots, then you're putting more black into that point, and those, we should start seeing those triangular moments, or those moments that join them, suddenly become a bit darker and a bit stronger. So there we go. You should be able to see we're just sort of getting a little bit more, because we're overlapping some lines to get them in there, and it just adds a little bit more depth and strength to that point. And I can just keep dividing, and in that very tiny bit, let's pop another little circle, because if you've got a little space, a circle is a really good way of filling it. Right, so no idea what this is, but I'm really quite enjoying all these sort of lines and this kind of feel of it, which is lovely. I think we've got this piece here on the side that's sort of like the one that we did that's sort of isolated away from it. Now we could certainly do exactly the same sort of treatment in that piece as we did in all the others, but I think it'd be quite nice to sort of slightly turn it on its head. I'm going to move my piece of paper because it's not, the camera's being not playing ball. There we go. So if I just take that to there, where I've got this sort of green area sort of round it, I'm going to now build on the outside of that shape. So I'm going to leave this white shape being kind of empty, and let's just see what that does. So I'm now going to put my first row of sort of little circle marks clustering around that, like the way you get one big soap bubble and all the little soap bubbles kind of cling to it all the way around. So I'm just going to build, and I always quite sort of see it almost quite sculptural, that we are kind of like building a surface and a texture onto this sort of background that we've created. Now, like a lot of these tutorials, we won't probably get the whole of this done in one tutorial, and what I quite like is that once we've sort of done another half hour on it and we come to say goodbye, it won't be finished, and then you can take it off in your own direction, and you've got a little something to come back to throughout the week to sort of like, you know, see where it takes you. Excellent. Oh, I do hope you scan it or photograph it and send it through to me, because I love seeing where other people take them, because it's always, everyone does it so differently, you know, and they're all really lovely. And then so I've got, so now that sort of, it's got a connection to the others, but it's doing something slightly different. So I think we're going to put some more of these sort of tendrils in, or our kind of wavy line kind of patterns, but I'm going to let them sort of stop at the yellow. I'm going to keep the yellow kind of adorned, but I'm going to bring the line, so I'm just following, this time I'm doing it around with the dot first and then bringing the line back to the circles. And then where I've got all green here, I can then take this right down, and let's whoosh that right down and see what that does feeling wise, just bringing those up into that sort of circle. And then I'm going to hit the edge of the paper again, so they're going to come up short and move round. And I can keep bringing, I've got this sort of dark blue area here, so I think I'll use that as a border as well. So this one is sort of, so we're responding to the paint that we've got there, and we're just following that edge of sort of blue kind of coming round there. And let's bring, so that's got sort of quite, this is sort of like becoming like sort of roots and sort of tendrils again, like those sort of spores and things that move through the earth. So again, we bring that up, but we're not going to touch the yellow, or we're going to go up and stop at the yellow. So we can bring all those round. And then there's a very little tiny bit here, and we're just going to be very strict about what we decide is yellow, just to give that an edge. And then that one is then kind of, it's connected to the others, but it's doing something slightly different. So let's come round again and bring the next layer of lines, because now once you've got one lot, it's much easier to come in close and get those second ones in the same kind of feel. And come round. At the moment I'm going to leave that as a lovely sort of ocean of white in the sort of green. It might stay white completely forever and ever. I might come back and do something in it later, but at the moment I'm quite liking it as a sort of a void in that corner. And then where I've got is, because I've got this sort of like a little archipelago of yellow, I'm going to do some lines that hit the yellow and then disappear underneath and come back round, and that's always gives it a very different kind of feel, gives it kind of three-dimensional feel. So that yellow starts to sort of pop out because the lines are kind of moving behind it. And I can do a similar kind of thing down here, just to leave so that where the yellow is, those lines are broken and then they reappear again. So it starts to help lift that yellow edge up like it was a piece of paper or something on the surface. It's quite a fun effect to do. Just sort of makes it, it gives it that sort of sense of depth that there's something happening behind. And then I'm going to follow our rules and just put a thin line in between as well, just to really finish that off. And then we'll look at what we can do with some of the drips. And again, I think what's important is that, you know, we could do more complicated patterns, and we might do something a bit more complicated on the drips, but these are really the most simple, most basic of patterns, and yet they create lots of fantastic different texture just by working with their environment and seeing how you can put them together in different sort of layers in different ways. And it's just, I think, really interesting how the result is complex, but the application is really, or should be, really simple and easy to understand, and so much about repetition and rhythm. And again, it's sort of typified by this going in between, like doing one set of spokes, then going in between, doing another and doing another. Because when you've done like 3 or 4 passes of spokes and you're really tightened together, people come back and look and go, oh my gosh, how did you draw them all so close together? And you go, well, I didn't really. They were further apart when I started. But it sort of has this sort of, it's a way of adding this sort of complexity, but without making it complicated, if that makes sense. So I'm just going to bring these last ones through. And again, thinking about where we've got this yellow, just make sure they stop as well. So they're continuing with this idea that the yellow is sitting on top of them. Just sort of moving, in between. And it's just helping to make that yellow pop out and become like a little piece standing out in its own right. And that really is the basic principle of perspective in drawings, is that what you have to do is not draw, work out what's sitting in front of something else, and the behind goes behind the foreground and then pops out again the other side. And if you have trouble doing it, I say to people, if you imagine you start your line and then you hit your edge and you lift your pen up and then pretend to draw and then put it down again and carry on, and then you'll find that you've really translated that line from one side of the foreground to the other, and it makes it really convincing that it really is travelling one over one or the other. Just do last line there. Right, okay, so now we've got this sort of corner in, so that's doing something. Again, sort of like it's becoming a background, it's related to these, but it's sort of like doing its own, slightly own thing. So with the sort of beanstalks that we've got coming up here, I like to think of them as sort of growing like Jack and the Giant beanstalks. I'd quite like to put something quite sort of elaborate in amongst them, I think, or something quite sort of decorative, So what I'm going to... It's all right. Yeah. Oh, it's like in Pitch Invasion. Right, so I want to get something that's got sort of like a foliage feel, but is not sort of direct foliage. So I'm going to use these, and I'm going to put like this sort of initially like this long S curve into, and sometimes it's going to be contained by these shapes. It's sort of like a sort of backwards or forwards, whichever way around S curve you want to do, sort of contained within these, but then maybe wrapping around some of them as well, just to sort of get a curly kind of feel. So we can do more. It's really hard to do them, if you're left-handed or right-handed, it's really hard to do them kind of the other way that you want to curve. But I'm going to put these in first, just a few, and then I'm going to show you. So they're just like sort of curlicues, snaky shapes, whatever kind of thing. But what we want is we're going to want this sort of like to be like a spine that we can work from. So then I'm going to put in a sort of teardrop shape that fits in, but it's all going to kind of grow off sort of like off this sort of spine. Then we're going to go, so I'm doing these sort of teardrops, and you can do them as sort of little curls, sort of just linking onto each other, but they become sort of quite foliage or leafy looking, and then you can just squeeze some little ones into and overlap like that, and then they're going to come up these sort of S shapes. So it's just these sort of and they sort of, you can make them get bigger so they can fill into the shape, but remember that you've got another curve coming here, so if you're not sure what's going to happen here, you might want to then start putting some on this sort of curve, so they kind of come up and round like that, and then you can follow this one up, and we start to get this sort of lovely kind of leafy kind of feel. And they're just sort of long fat teardrops really, and they sort of go off to a point, and you can get them to curl round and to sort of fit into all sorts of shapes, but they look like sort of frondy leaves. And here on this bit here, I've sort of let this one is going in front, and then this one's overlapping, so again the ones that are on behind kind of disappear behind, and then the ones on top, they kind of link over. And I'm just going to keep building up some of these S shapes. And then if you've got a space in between, again, your choice is you could put some more in, but you could also put some circles that always, as we did with the triangle down there, they're always really useful to put in, is sort of like some little circles. They're great literal sort of space fillers. So round we come, just coming up round, and they look sort of quite leafy and maybe like foliage, and that sort of helps that kind of beanstalk kind of feel. So I've got this sort of pattern happening up in here, but I'd like to get it to kind of maybe come down here a little bit, or to have something that's connecting it a bit to here. So I think if we keep on, maybe take some of those spirals down into the sort of, I'm seeing this as earth now, of course, this sort of blue forest kind of floor, kind of bluey green forest floor. So let's just see if we can bring some of those down into here. And then I've got this sort of fuzz of that blue paint that we put on that was originally going up and is now going down. And then so maybe imagine if this was coming down and then it was coming down into some of our radiating lines, as if it's sort of moving up through the soil into those sort of shapes there, and perhaps where it sort of comes up here, we can start connecting with some of those lines, and they can start being growing into curlicues, something like that. So it's got this sort of feeling of connection to the shapes that are going on below. And then you've got like a rhythm that we're building up in the whole piece really. It's starting to have a sort of connection, and it's talking about things growing underground. And I've got sort of an edge of paint here, so I'm going to sort of, again, like I did with the yellow, I'm going to sort of respect that edge and just sort of let them stop, so that I'm sort of definitely got a border line at some point. And then, so maybe these are like trees in a forest, and this is like sort of an ivy or something that's curling over them. I don't know, but we just make them longer and just let them hook round and sort of grow. And on this side they can come up, and you can just have loads of fun with these leaf shapes and let them sort of merge in amongst each other. So they're sort of drawing and growing around these sort of shapes. And you can see where this one is sort of curling under, again I can pretend this one's going on top, and then this one, so it's going to tuck behind, but here it's going to come in front. And that starts to get this sort of nice sort of feel of perspective, and just changing them around. So we've got some in front and some behind. And then we can bring these lines curling down into the sort of soil, and then they're coming out, twisting round and becoming these sort of grow lines or roots down to the seeds. And, you know, we didn't know we were going to get into something quite so botanical when we started, but that's definitely where it's going. And that's lovely, as you kind of starts making sense of these sort of strange worlds that you create. And it's funny how you often start sort of like saying, oh, well, this looks a bit like a plant or a bit like something else, and I can exaggerate that and make it feel more like that. You think, I didn't stay out to draw something, but it seems to be what I've drawn. So we can just bring all these lovely leaf shapes curling around. And these are nice because you could add in some, if you want to go really small and sort of like zoom in on some of the detail of these, if I can bring my camera in a bit closer, we can get quite a nice three-dimensional feel by using, again, just the sort of small lines that we were drawing with a sort of smaller pen. It's quite intricate, but we can do some of these little lines on that sort of leaf surface, but let them curl, give them a curve, and then that starts to make this into like quite a strong form. You know, it gives it, again, a sort of surface. Like it's sort of, these lines are both giving it a bit of tone, but also telling me that this is a round object. And that's like another area you can bring on and work on it. So they sort of, it's just like doing a series of brackets, really. You know, it sort of might feel complicated at first, but if you just say, if you put one in the middle first, and then you just echo that line like we did before, but just like as if we're doing a series of brackets. Imagine hitting a typewriter key with just like bracket, bracket, bracket in a row like that. And then you can bring them closer together to get a bit more tone. I hope that is showing up all right. It's always you know, these cameras are really designed for conferences and all the set. Good, good. So I'm just doing these repeated, just very simple, just like little curved bracket lines. And if you try and fit more in towards the tail of the shape and then let them open out a bit as they come up, it will again start to give it that sense of tone and a bit of highlight as well. So you can always pack some more in down the bottom, sort of round the tails. I think of them as tails. They're sort of like fat tadpoles, really. And they come up and they open out. And that's, you're just going with the shape that you've, oops! Naughty boy. It's like having a, you know, this is my equivalent of having a dog jump on me. So you can just, close to the pointy end, you just pack those lines in really tightly, and then as you come up you open them out and leave more paper showing. And it's just a way of getting the packed close together. It's more black pen on the paper, it makes it darker. Opening it out, it's less black pen on the paper, it's sort of giving it light. So just close together and then let them separate out, and that starts to give them sort of a bit of tone and a bit of substance. They're not just hollow shapes, they become, gives them a bit of form. And we can just continue that through them all. And it also, they almost look a little bit like seashells, I sort of think, you know. It gives that little bit of surface. So again, it's just something, and eventually what I do is sort of try and build this whole forest of leaves and curlicues and spirals moving through this area, because then you've got this idea of these sort of seeds underground bursting forth into this amazing world. And if you ever think about the potential there must be inside a seed, the energy that must be in there. If you think about that acorn, it can grow all the way up into an oak tree that's sort of like, you know, nearly 20 foot high. I mean, it's incredible, isn't it? I think that potential is inside that tiny little seed. It is quite magical. So we can get, you know, the more curlicues, the more structures we can build in to kind of like bring all these through, and then this forest is going to get stronger and more strange and beauteous. And we might even, I really like this way you can sort of like bring the pen lines going round the paint marks, so they're sort of interacting with them, so they become more kind of three-dimensional. And I think maybe as we get up to the top, we can even start putting some exotic flowers into the mix, or some shapes that can kind of become something that represents flowers. Something like, you know, just using the teardrop shapes, but just changing some of the profiles. That's just a sort of big wobbly shape really, but it starts to have a lighter kind of feel, like it's some kind of flower blooming in this strange forest that we've created. And you know, yes, this is why I love them, because you just keep going and going, and suddenly these little worlds have been created and you think, wow, where did all this come from? Yeah, so there's some sort of like floral shapes. And then here on this corner here, look, we've got all this underground roots here, so we can start bringing some of them up and through and then into some big curly cues again. And just seeing how all these shapes are going to grow and fill up with spirals and leaves, and so again it's just more areas that you can take, and more, and if you keep them sort of right down the bottom relatively small and just little sort of nuggets and circles, and then as you come up you can get into some bigger curly shapes. You could even put some curls within curls, add some little curls in between, and decide how you're going to come into those sort of tight ends. And then once you've got all of these drawn in, you can keep on adding tonal detail to your heart's content really. It's what's so lovely about it, because once you've got, just as really it's just like, you know, we start off by dividing the page into larger areas with our circles and not circles, and then we subdivide that with paint, and then we go into those circles and subdivide those, and we just keep going down and down and down until we're working on tiny little bubbles of space. But if someone said to you, right, draw that bubble there and then do a pattern, build a picture from the whole thing, you'd never work that way around. It wouldn't be madness, but you know, you'd never see the vision. But we just keep on thinking, you know, what can we add, what shapes can we put in, what little areas can we put in, how can we explore these moments that the paint has given us. You know, how are we going to follow the paint? Are we going to do something in opposition to the paint? That's really what it's about, and just letting yourself explore. And if you get a bit that works, you go, that's brilliant, I'll do that again. And if you get a bit that doesn't work, you go, oh, well, I'll just draw it differently next time, you know. And that's sort of all part of it. And sometimes you find a sort of shape that really takes your fancy, and you just sort of develop it, and you can use it again and again, and it becomes really part of your kind of repertoire again. So there we go, just all these ones just sort of filling in, growing and growing. And I think I will just do a few more roots, and then we could even just do some little teardrop shapes coming up. And we can even think about the surface of these drops. These drops could have a texture on these sort of like streaks coming down. They can have a texture. And maybe to get them differently, just some simple vertical, horizontal lines in groups like that to give them a slightly bark-like texture. No pun intended, bark-like. Just to sort of bring us in. We could even follow some of those paint marks and exaggerate whether it's sort of spread so that our trunk of our tree gets a sort of edge to it, or a kind of fuzz that we can work with. So there we go. So I think we will, let me just draw my camera back a bit, and you can sort of get, hopefully, whoops, we're seeing the kind of overall, oh, don't fall off again. It's the bumpiness of the paper, it tends to push the tape out. I will photograph it and scan it and put some sort of frames at the beginning, at the end of the film, and just sort of send them through so you can kind of see it at a distance. But I think you can see you've got this lovely rhythm that's happening, and you have got here something, even though it's really abstract, there is sort of like a story. There is this feeling of these things underground and then these things growing up, and sort of a forest happening from this sort of underground, this sleeping form underneath with all these sort of activity and potential. And so there we go. I hope I hope that was enjoyable.